I'm Erin Moat. I'm the CEO of Innovate EDU, and I have the extraordinary pleasure of hosting two very, very smart women who know more about the budget, about reconciliation and rescission than I will ever know, and could probably talk about this for 8 hours versus one. So the good news is you have the best folks to ask your questions of, and that is Bethany Little and Robin Heistend today joining us. I'm going to introduce them in just a second. So don't worry, you'll know all about them in just 1 minute. But before I do that, let me talk a little bit about the logistics of the webinar. Next slide, please. Oh, so before we get to this, Galen, if you could go back, we will be making sure that questions are delivered in the Q&A function of the webinar. Please do not put your questions in the chat. Please use the Q&A function. I will be moderating the questions for about 20 minutes towards the end of the webinar. You might not hear the exact phrasing of your question because if this webinar is anything like the other webinars Innovate EDU has hosted, we'll have lots of questions and we're going to have to group them so that everybody gets an opportunity to hear a little bit about their questions and the answers that they might have. Also, while I do have a crystal ball on my desk, it doesn't work. And so there's a lot here that we don't know yet about specific policies, procedures, and things like that. So some of the answers to your questions will be like, we'll have to see, or I don't know. And I want to make sure that you have that expectation going in. With that, let me introduce our presenters before we move to their content. First is Bethany Little. She's the managing principal over at Education Council. She supports foundations, nonprofit organizations, including Innovate EDU, states, districts, and institutions of higher education to drive systems change for equity and advance improvements in education outcomes from early childhood through higher education. Bethany is a dedicated advocate. She's been working for over 20 years in government as an advocate, including in the U.S. Senate as the Chief Education Counsel for the HELP Committee, also working for Senators Edward Kennedy and Tom Harkin, and was also a legislative aide to Patty Murray. If you know education and education policy, you know Bethany Little, because she has been at the heart of so much of our work in this sector for a very, very long time. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bethany. Anything that I missed in your bio that folks should need to know? Great. Robin, you're up next. Robin is a vice president at Boys Public Affairs Group. She's also spent 20 years working in government and nonprofit organizations. In the U.S. Senate, she wrote Senator Sanders' college affordability platform, the College for All Act. Thank you for doing that, and took a lead role in drafting and developing the 2013 Bipartisan Budget Act for Senator Murray. In addition, Robin has tracked federal funding for public health initiatives at NIH. I know we have some folks from the NIH NSF community joining us today, as well as for key science and research agencies, including the NSF, the Department of Defense, and NASA. In the nonprofit arena, she's advocated for educational equity for underrepresented students, including at the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, where she established the things I love, a comprehensive data project to define success metrics for tribal college students. So I could go on and on about these two women and just keep reading their bios for about 20 minutes in the webinar. I'm going to stop doing that. Robin, is there anything you think our folks need to know about you that I missed in your bio?
No, just happy to be here.
We're so happy to have you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Robin to kick us, and Bethany to kick us off.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin. I'm going to get us going. The one thing that wasn't said in the bio, but is worth saying out loud, is that Robin and I did a budget reconciliation bill together many, many years ago in the Senate. And so have that real life experience and can draw from that for the conversation today. I'm going to start just by quickly doing a differentiation between rescission, appropriations, and budget. And then Robin's going to do a deep dive into the budget itself and then the budget process itself. So first, most of what we're going to talk about is process. And then I'm going to take it back and do a little bit about the current budget bill, although we'll chime in on each other's stuff as we go. And we look forward mostly to addressing the things that you have questions about. So we'll try to move quickly to get to that part. A lot of folks are saying, wait a minute, lots of numbers flying around, lots of people saying this is cut and this is cut and the president's doing this and Congress is doing this. How do you keep track? And the truth is there are multiple processes in play right now, and it's worth understanding how they differ in process and what's being asked for in each. So I'm going to talk first about rescission. We haven't had a rescission process in a while. There were some requested under the Trump administration last time around, but they were not granted by Congress. And so it's been a minute since we've done some rescission work. But the way rescission works is that this is existing funds that have already been appropriated and already are sort of at the agencies ready to be spent and the Treasury's set aside. The president can submit a request to Congress, and in fact, has to submit a request to Congress to kick off a rescission process. And so Congress then has 45 days to act, a time limit by which it can act. It can approve, disapprove, or amend the request. The key thing about a rescission is that even though a majority of Congress, including over 60 votes in the Senate, has approved the funding, they only need a simple majority to pass a rescission. And so this is something that right now, because we have what we call a trifecta in Washington, where the House, the Senate, and the White House are all three controlled by the same party, they can pass in the House, pass in the Senate, and have the president sign things with only a majority vote, and this rescission falls into that category. So this rescission process may be in use, and there is no limit on the number of rescission bills a president can ask for, and Congress can choose to pass. So we could see multiple rescission bills that could come up in the months and years ahead. The first rescission package has been sent up to the Congress by the president, and the first one calls for about $9.4 billion in rescissions of spending. That $9.4 billion includes pretty significant rescissions, basically zeroing out funds for USAID, as well as Corporation for Public Broadcasting, NPR, PBS. So National Public Radio, Public Broadcasting Service. So all of those things are all at risk in this rescission, and they have 45 days to make a decision in Congress on whether or not to pass that. We'll talk more about the makeup of the House and the Senate, but it's worth noting here that the House has what is traditionally considered a very slim majority with only a 3-vote lead, and so they can only afford to lose 3. Now the House is a wide group of people, and so it's hard to keep that many people together. The Senate has the same 3-vote the same 3-vote margin. I said majority. Same 3-vote margin for the majority, and yet in the Senate, that's a pretty wide lead. They can afford to lose 3 people and still pass things in a simple majority vote. And so really important to understand that this rescission package has a good chance of going through. They are holding the trifecta, but it is not a sure thing because those margins are tough to work with. Let's talk about appropriations in the next slide. So the rescission process, one thing, lots of numbers being thrown around. The other thing we're hearing a lot about these days is the FY 2026 appropriations process. Appropriations processes are generally considered kicked off when the president releases the president's budget request to Congress. And that has happened in 2 phases. This is the first in my memory of a 2-phase presidential budget request. They did what people called the skinny budget. Actually, it's not. They've done this before. The skinny budget a couple of weeks ago. And then just last Friday, released what I like to call the fat budget. And so we have now seen multiple parts of the president's budget request. The president requests the budget. That does not change anything in the law. It's just what the president would like to see happen. And traditionally, and including under the last Trump administration, the president requests many, many things that are not in fact passed by Congress. An appropriations bill goes through regular order. That means it requires 60 votes to pass in the Senate, which means they will need bipartisan support to do the things that are in the president's budget request. They've already said that they're going to have House appropriations markups in July, and Senate markups will probably take place soon as well, but the dates have not been released for those yet. In the president's budget request this year, the Department of Education is cut by $12 billion. That's about a 15% cut in the U.S. Department of Education budget request. IES, the Institute for Education Sciences, where a lot of our education research and data collection lives, cut by 67% to $261 million. It's almost a $600 million cut in IES. And then EIR, another source of education research, innovation grants, also zeroed out entirely. So this is a real focus on the research component of this. But there are other big changes in this budget to lose $12 billion. For example, most of Title I and IDEA is held intact, but they take about 18 other education ESEA programs, combine them together into one block grant, and then cut that by $4.65 billion. So lots of cuts proposed in the president's budget request this year. $5 billion in cuts to the National Science Foundation, and $18 billion in cuts to the National Institutes of Health. The 15% caps on indirect are in both the NSF and the NIH request. And so there are lawsuits underway where there has been suit filed on whether or not those 15% caps that have been unilaterally imposed may hold. But this is the president requesting that policy be put into law. Again, to put that policy into law, to put those cuts into law, would require a majority vote in the Senate. I'm sorry, more than a majority vote in the Senate, a 60 person vote in the Senate, which would require bipartisanship. How does the budget reconciliation process differ from appropriations and rescissions? I'm going to turn it over to Robin to tell you.
Thank you. Next slide. So budget reconciliation is a little bit different than what Bethany was just talking about in terms of appropriations. Budget reconciliation is a budget process outlined in Section 310 of the Congressional Budget Act. It is a process to look at the budget over a 10-year window as opposed to a 1-year window, which is what the Appropriations Committee does. So the chambers will look at spending. And when I talk about spending, I'm talking a different type of spending. I'm talking about mandatory spending that is not subject to appropriations. That's not subject to the annual review of the Appropriations Committee. These are programs that are sort of on autopilot. Think of your food nutrition program, student loans, a portion of Pell Grants. Medicaid is the one that's getting a lot of attention as of late. So Congress, each chamber will look at spending of those programs, and they'll look at revenues, they'll look at the deficit number and the debt, and they'll make adjustments over a 10-year window. And to do that, you usually have to increase taxes or cut spending. You have to do politically difficult things. And as an incentive to do what many lawmakers view as difficult, there are expedited procedures and rules that are of significant value in the U.S. Senate, which I will get to in a minute. But in order to get reconciliation, you have to have a conference budget resolution that outlines the topics that you want to cover in reconciliation. So you can look at spending, you can look at revenue, and you can do a debt limit. You can combine all three of those topics into one bill. That is the bill that's being discussed right now. It covers revenue, it covers mandatory spending, and it covers the debt limit. Or you can do discrete pieces of those topics. So you could separate them out if you wanted to. So there, in theory, could be three different types of reconciliation: one covering taxes, one covering budget, one covering taxes, one covering spending, and one covering the debt limit. But again, that's not what is happening currently in the Congress. It is a powerful tool, and it is usually leveraged when there is what Bethany said is a trifecta. There's unified control of the House and the Senate and the White House. And it's usually done to enact major pieces of legislation of a president or a party's agenda. But there are some restrictions to it. Next slide. Key features of reconciliation. Because reconciliation is the jurisdiction of the Budget Committee, and it is an optional process. That means Congress has high-level policy strategy discussions, usually at the very top level. We're talking the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader, the President himself, as well as his very senior staffers. It is an optional process. You could move things through regular order. but it is a big deal in the Senate. Why is it a big deal? Because it circumvents the filibuster. It puts limits on debate. The Senate has a tradition of endless debates. There are restrictions on amendments that can be offered. Reconciliation has been used on both sides with both parties. The Trump tax cuts, the Bush tax cuts were all done through reconciliation. And most recently, reconciliation was done under the Biden administration, the American Rescue Plan, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, I guess, going to be repealed. Elements of it will be repealed, is being proposed to be repealed. Next slide. So how does the process work? The budget committees must draft a budget resolution proposing reconciliation and instructing key committees in Congress. That happened earlier this year. The House and the Senate had two different kind of approaches to it. The Senate wanted to do two different reconciliation bills. They wanted to do a homeland, immigration, defense bill first. And then later in this calendar year, the Senate wanted to do the tax piece, the expiration of the Trump tax cuts. But the House had a different strategy. They wanted to do one big, beautiful bill. So when the House and the Senate were considering their budget resolution, ultimately, the strategy that was endorsed was the House strategy to do one big, beautiful bill. I put this slide in there because there was some chatter earlier this year that the House could do their own thing and then the Senate could write their own piece of legislation and then conference them. That's not the case. You need a framework, a conferenced budget resolution in order for reconciliation to happen. After you have that conference budget resolution, and again, this is just a framework, it's not making specific changes to law, that happens next. And that is what happened in May, where you have specific committees putting pen to paper, writing changes into the law, making changes to various programs, and then moving it through committee, moving it through the House floor, and now it is in the Senate. Next slide. So the parameters of consideration, it is a very, 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 very big deal in the United States Senate. That's why I have the Senate seal there. Much of the Senate is guided by unanimous consent agreements. So you have the consent of all 100 senators to move forward a piece of legislation. There's also the tradition of the filibuster. Generally, things need 60 votes in the Senate. Reconciliation circumvents that. You are immediately going to the piece of legislation. You cannot debate the motion to proceed. You only need 51 votes to pass. The other element of reconciliation is that amendments have to be germane to the committees instructed. What does that mean? That means if there is a provision in reconciliation that touches the Veterans Affairs Committee, that provision is not germane to the Veterans Affairs Committee because the Veterans Affairs Committee was not instructed in the reconciliation. So in theory, it would violate the Byrd Rule. There are limits on debate. The Senate has a tradition of talking and talking and talking about pieces of legislation, offering all sorts of amendments on any piece of legislation that comes to the floor. Again, reconciliation circumvents that. There are limits on debate. Amendments have to be budgetary in nature. You cannot do a lot of policy amendments on reconciliation. And after that 20 hours expires, you go into what is called vote-a-rama, and that can get very nasty very quickly. Think of very toxic political amendments that the other side of the aisle does not want to take votes on. For example, when Bethany and I were doing this, many years ago, it was guns on Amtrak or guns in National Park. If you are an in-cycle member up for re-election, you don't necessarily want to take votes on some of these toxic amendments. And vote-a-rama really goes until exhaustion. All of this process is overseen by the Senate parliamentarian. Next slide. Byrd Rule. So whenever there is talk of reconciliation, there's talk of the Byrd Rule. The Byrd Rule was established in 1985 and then codified into law in 1990. It is named after the late Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, who was known to argue in favor of preserving antiquated traditions and decorum, especially in the US Senate. There are 6 provisions of the Byrd Rule outlined here. The one that tends to get a lot of attention is that a provision doesn't produce a change in outlays or revenue. That means it's a policy provision. It's not budgetary in nature. And according to the Congressional Research Service, it is the most common violation of the Byrd Rule. The Byrd Rule is taken very, very, very seriously in the US Senate. Violations of the Byrd Rule threatened the privileged status, the expedited status of reconciliation during Senate floor consideration. And as such, before reconciliation even comes to the Senate floor, there is a very, very thorough review by the Senate parliamentarian for violations of the Byrd Rule. And that is happening literally right now. As a courtesy, the Senate parliamentarian will have related staff into her office to do an initial review of the legislation. And that is what's called a Byrd bath. And once reconciliation is finalized in the Senate, any violations of the Byrd Rule will be published in the congressional record, if there is any. In the past, there hasn't, there's been such a thorough scrub that there has not been violations of the Byrd Rule. The Byrd Rule is subject to interpretation by the Senate parliamentarian, and she relies on Senate precedent of the Byrd Rule, as well as estimates, scoring estimates, budgetary estimates from the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation. She also consults with the chair of the Senate Budget Committee. If the parliamentarian determines a provision violates the Byrd Rule, a senator can raise a point of order. The motion to waive a point of order is 60 votes. Generally, if there is a Byrd Rule violation, motions to waive are not successful. Usually they just take the bill out. That's why we do the Byrd bath. So there's no provisions that would violate Byrd. House lawmakers generally don't like this dynamic. They say it skews the balance of power between the House versus the Senate. You're seeing some of that play out a little bit now. The Senate parliamentarian, she is appointed, she is not elected, and she also relies on estimates by congressional scorekeepers, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Joint Committee on Taxation. The current parliamentarian has been working in the Senate, in the parliamentarian's office since 1999. She has been parliamentarian since 2012. And she has served under the leadership of both Republicans and Democrats. She works at the behest of the Senate Majority Leader. And I think so kick it back to you, Bethany, who will go over
Awesome.
some of the details.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. So we've talked a little bit about what the process of reconciliation basically always looks like, with some details about what's happening now. We're going to get into what this particular reconciliation is looking like, and particularly what this one big beautiful bill means for education. Now, you may wonder why I'm willing to call it the one big beautiful bill, since certainly from my own perspective as a person who's advocated for education my whole career, I do not consider much about this bill to be beautiful, even though it's definitely big. But that is in fact the official name of the bill. That is not a nickname. In the House, at least, the bill is called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So that is quite an interesting decision, and there are some other interesting naming decisions throughout. So what's in there for education? Go ahead to the next slide and let's dive into it. On a process of where this bill stands. So the House has a 10-year bill. It looks at FY 2025 through FY 2034. And that bill, at the most recent score by the Congressional Budget Office, adds $2.4 trillion to the deficit. This is what Elon Musk is complaining about. So traditionally, budget reconciliation bills, as Robin said, they're hard to pass. You have these special protected procedures because people think, oops, this is going to be something that people are not going to do because traditionally they're used to cut spending. They're used to address the deficit. But this bill actually adds enormously to the deficit. So that is going to be a potential point of contention with traditional hardline conservatives who would like to see the deficit reduced in this kind of thing. And yet it did pass the House on a party line vote with only 2 Republican representatives opposing the bill. This is very notable because in my experience, having worked in Washington and on Capitol Hill for many, many years, it is extremely hard to get a bill this controversial with that many members of Congress, House members who were standing up and saying, I don't like what's in here. I can't vote for this. This bill is problematic. And then they all rolled over and voted for it. It's really important to note the power the president is wielding at this moment to have this kind of vote on a bill this controversial. You had people who thought it cut way too much, people who thought it didn't cut enough, people who wanted to see deficit reduction, and here we have a massive deficit increase. And so this was a very controversial bill, and yet it passed with very little opposition from the party. And so this is really notable. What this tells me is they will get a reconciliation bill across the finish line. People are willing to sort of roll over and take votes that they do not agree with in principle in order to deliver on this big, beautiful bill. That's what you learn from that. The Senate action is starting now. The Senate committees began rolling out their committee bills this week. And so we've already seen Senate Armed Services has put their bill out. That means all the other committees that have been writing their bills for some time are probably going through their bird baths, getting in there with the parliamentarian to figure out what about what we've written will pass and not be subject to a point of order. Nobody wants to be subject to that point of order. The president has said that he wants to sign a bill by July 4th. That will not happen. Senator John Thune, who's our majority leader, has said just this week that he hopes to get the Senate bill done by the July 4th recess. That will be a challenge, but because of these special rules that limit the time of debate on the floor, I think there's a good chance he will get something out of the Senate by July 4th. I do think that that will look very different from what's passed in the House. Even though Senator Thune has said he wants to see it be as close as possible to the House bill, we already know that there are going to be things that change. And as a result, when that happens, there won't be the ability to just move that bill back to the House and finalize that bill. They're going to have to go through a conference. They're going to have to agree on a new text for the House and Senate bill. And that new text is going to have to be passed by the House again and by the Senate again. So final passage by both chambers will be needed. And so you'll have to get again the ability of them to pull a majority in both chambers to get a final bill. They are really pushing to do that by August recess on Capitol Hill, in part because they're coming up on the debt limit. And when they hit the debt limit, we have massive potential financial implications throughout the world, certainly inside the United States. And so that forcing event is really going to drive them to try to get this bill done before the August recess. August recess starting August 4th, for those of you who are not sort of congressional watchers. So that means really we're talking the next month is in the next 2 months are an enormous time of activity. There's going to be a lot that's going to happen that's going to be decisive for a long time to come. What exactly are they going to do? Let's get into the next slide and start talking about what's in this bill. So I'm talking right now about the House budget reconciliation package, because that's the one that we've seen. That's the one that's written. That's what we're working off of. And as Robin noted earlier, in a very unusual turn of events, the House and the Senate do not have the same instructions in this bill. So we could see some really different things. In the House, there are $350 billion in cuts over 10 years in the Education and Workforce Committee, mostly in higher education. We have seen significant changes to student loans. It eliminates the subsidized loan program, and it really decreases the availability of loans for the graduate and parent borrowing. That will be really significant for institutions of higher education that rely heavily, frankly, on the Grad Plus program for a lot of tuition money. The student loan repayment options, which will have impact on folks trying to repay, including teachers around the country. They will have a new standard repayment plan and one new income-driven repayment plan. Right now, we have many of them based on earnings, and it is less generous than all of the ones that currently exist. And so we will see a reduction in sort of the options for student loan repayment. The Pell Grant reductions in the House bill are quite significant. It starts with this less than 15 hours per semester and less than half-time attendees, and that will cut either the entire eligibility or some amount of what they receive to somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of all Pell recipients. This is a major cut in Pell Grant availability to folks. It also creates a new workforce Pell program, sort of ironic, on one hand giveth and the other hand taketh away, that would be about these very short-term programs, less than 8-week programs that would be newly eligible for Pell Grants under this provision in the House. And then the House bill also includes new risk sharing and promise grants. What does risk sharing mean? Essentially, what they're doing is they're saying if there are institutions of higher education that use large amounts of student loan volume, they have a lot of people taking on student loans who don't repay those student loans, who do not come out able with a degree to be able to repay them, then those institutions could have to repay the federal government on behalf of their students. And so they call it risk sharing because the institution of higher education is taking on the risk of some of that debt. They also have a small grant program to sort of try to make up for some of that debt. But overall, there's a lot of concerns with this risk sharing and the types of institutions that would be most vulnerable to it. You're talking about institutions that rely on high debt populations who have a lot of students with a lot of debt who attend their institutions could see a lot of potential loss of funding, the requirement to pay back the federal government under this. Keep on going because I got to talk fast. We got a few minutes left into the next slide where I think we're going to talk about energy and commerce. This is where Medicaid lives in the House. Major cuts in Medicaid, over $800 billion over 10 years. The most important thing to understand about these Medicaid cuts, I say here sort of how do they happen and what do those cuts look like? They look like things like work requirements, new cost sharing. You have to pay new premiums, new, goodness, what's it called when you go and you have to pay a payment to your doctor? Thank you, copay. Thank you, Robin. New copays, new work requirements, new eligibility redeterminations. If I have to go every 6 months and re-up my Medicaid, I don't know if any of you have been through this process, but it is no joke. It takes time. It takes finding 6 million forms. You have to take time off work. It's no joke. So all of these things are basically trying to reduce people's access to healthcare, and that is saving them $800 billion. They also reduce the amount that the federal government will pay if the state is giving health coverage to undocumented individuals, even if they're not using federal dollars to do that, even if they're only using their state dollars. So this is where all the cuts come from. But the most important thing to understand about the cuts is the ripple effects of those cuts. About 15 million people between those ripple effects of the Medicaid cuts and what it would do with Affordable Care Act interactions could mean about 15 million people would lose healthcare. That includes a lot of students, both higher ed students who rely on Medicaid and students whose families, K-12 students whose families rely on Medicaid, and schools, K-12 schools get a lot of Medicaid dollars to provide services in schools, particularly for students with disabilities, but also mental health services. There are many services provided. And then the most important thing to know about the ripple effects is that these holes in the health budget will be filled by the state. So state budget fights in the next legislative session will be ugly. You will be talking about big holes in state budgets. The two biggest pieces of every state's budget are Medicaid and education. So these things will be pitted against each other because of these cuts. Moving on from energy and commerce, let's talk about it's agriculture next. No, SNAP. We're going to talk about SNAP next. If I get my next slide. Yeah, agriculture. There we go. $260 billion in cuts over 10 years. This is requiring states to pay for some food and nutrition assistance. That not only will, again, add to state holes in state budgets, we will have ripple effects there, and they have specifically higher state portions. Traditionally, the federal government covers all of food and nutrition assistance, but now they're saying, nope, we're going to give some of this over to state. That will impact school meals as well. As families and students lose ability to access school meals, that will ripple into the schools, where now, for example, you may have so many kids eligible for meals in your district that you're able to offer universal meals, but as fewer students are eligible, you may no longer be able to offer universal meals. And so suddenly you've got these ripple effects going into your schools. And then expanding work requirements is one of the ways they do that. I've got two more, I think, and I'm going to be done. Let's talk about ways and means where all the taxes take place. So in the taxes, there's a lot here. There's the higher ed endowment tax, a lot of money they're being raised. Actually, I lie. I call this the scholarship tax. It doesn't actually raise that much money, but it does go after endowments by a big change. Right now, the endowment tax applies to a very small number of institutions that have very large endowments, and it's 1.4%. It creates a sliding scale where, depending on the size of your endowment, if you have as high as $2 million per student endowment, you can get up to a 21% tax on your investment income from your endowment. And so this would be a big blow to higher ed. Most endowment funds, the majority of endowment funds, go to financial aid. Others go to things like endowed chairs and support for faculty research, among other things. Similarly, in foundations, philanthropy also going from a very small current rate of taxation of investments, which used to not exist at all, to a large one of 10%. That will cut into what foundations have available to fund out into programs, projects, research in the world. There is a big voucher program in the House bill, $20 billion over 4 years. And most importantly, that $20 billion does not just go from a federal government to a parent. It goes into states and districts where people create scholarship funds, and this subsidizes those scholarship funds. So they are now pushing vouchers into states and districts. Every state in the country will have a voucher program as a result of this if it passes. $20 billion over 4 years. And then there's these child tax credit increase, which is great that it goes from $2,000 to $2,500, but as you note, only until 2028, the end of the Trump term. And then suddenly it snaps back to only $2,000. And then finally, these used to be called MAGA accounts. I was impressed by their ability to come up with a MAGA account, money account for growth and advancement. These are children's savings accounts, now renamed in the last version of the bill as Trump accounts that would be in this bill. So that's what's in the House package. Let's go to the final, I think my final slide. Where are we going now into the Senate? So as we said earlier, separate instructions. This is not typical. This will cause a lot of disruption. Usually you're using the same instructions on savings in the House and the Senate. An example is $330 billion requirement for savings in the House, $1 billion in the Senate, just in the Education Committee. So that tells you how different the House and Senate education bills could look when they come out. The Senate Republicans can only lose 3 Republican votes. It's actually quite a few. 3 is like they can afford to lose a few folks. But you do have folks who are saying they're not on board with this. Folks like Josh Hawley and Susan Collins are saying they don't want to see these Medicaid cuts, possibly Lisa Murkowski and Jim Justice from West Virginia. You also have fiscal concern. These are folks who are against the cuts. They don't want to see financial aid, Pell cuts. They don't want to see Medicaid cuts. Then you have fiscal conservatives like Rand Paul and Ron Johnson who are saying, I want more deficit reduction. I want to see more savings. And that also looks like cuts. So there's a lot of challenge to do a bill in the Senate that can also go back and pass the House and then come back again to the Senate. So they will need to make changes in the bill to pass the Senate. They will then have to go into this conference and come back again. I think that was my last slide. Let's see. Yes, we're at questions. Erin, over to
Wow, you guys, so impressive. I think I gave you an impossible task, which was process and particulars in 40 minutes. So let's start first with some of the Q&A around process, just to chime in here. Couple questions around the Senate parliamentarian, the most powerful person in Washington, D.C. right now, maybe besides the president. If the Senate parliamentarian raises a challenge, could she be replaced with someone else who's willing to look the other way on bird rule violations?
Yes, and that has happened in the past. When President Bush was doing his his Bush tax cuts, they expired after 10 years. And the reason why they expired after 10 years was because of the bird rule. And so the Senate Majority Leader at the time, I can't remember if it was Trent Lott or Frist or did not like that ruling from the Senate parliamentarian. It was a gentleman by the name of Bob Dove, and so they fired him and replaced him with someone else. So yes, she can be fired. that has been done before.
Not so peaceful, right, for Bob
Yeah.
Dunn. Let's talk about the votorama. So all the amendments that are brought up during the votorama also previously reviewed by the parliamentarian?
Nope. No,
Yep.
these are nasty. Like, think of like anything that would go viral. Like, these are not budgetary and germane, anything goes.
So so they don't have to be germane, which is the next part of the question. They don't have to be germane to the bill, and they don't have to be relevant to the proposal at hand, right, Robin?
Nope.
Right. And this is what I like to call campaign ad footage time. So this is the stuff that for folks who are going to be on cycle, they're going to be very sensitive about this particular set of things.
Yes. As I had mentioned earlier, like guns on Amtrak, if John Tester isn't in the Senate anymore, or guns in National Park, if you're John Tester, you don't want to take a vote on that. So yes, campaign ads, I think, is a great way to think about this, especially for the senators that are going to be in cycle in a year and a half.
Great. 2 more on process. I heard California legislators have a way around the bird rule. Is that possible?
Okay, so this is kind of a cheeky question.
We like cheeky questions here at Innovate EDU. We're a cheeky organization. So.
And this is like a little bit because it has to do with, I think, environmental standards and and Bethany, I don't know if you know the details on this about the Congressional Review Act. So GAO, there was some rule, an EPA rule, I believe it was, that the Government Accountability Office said does not need to go through the Congressional Review Act, and the parliamentarian agreed with the GAO. And there was a vote in the Senate maybe 2 weeks ago that was sort of seen as a test run or a dry run against overruling the parliamentarian. And that vote got 51 votes, I think, including 1 Democratic senator. So that it was sort of like a test run on overruling the parliamentarian. One of the big things as this on the reconciliation that has sort of, in addition to the margins and the votes and how do you craft the bill to get it through the House, the big point of contention has been the deficit impact. And there's been a lot of discussion on how to score the bill, whether you use a current policy baseline versus a current law baseline. And the Senate parliamentarian may have to rule on that in the next 10 days, 2 weeks. And that is the chatter of overruling the parliamentarian, which, yeah, it's sort of inside baseball, very inside baseball question. But, could pop its head in the next week or 2.
And we didn't cover the Congressional Review Act, but if folks have, they can sort of just understand that to be a period by which this Congress can reconsider rules and regulations passed during a specific time period in the previous administration. That's the simplest way I can explain CRA in 3 sentences. Last procedural question, also a little cheeky. I like the cheeky ones, y'all. When was the last time an appropriations bill was passed? Is there any reason to think that one could pass this year? So not a continuing resolution. Bethany, you want to jump in here?
Sure. It's actually not that long ago. This year we have a year-long continuing resolution, but as recently as FY24, we actually passed appropriations bills, and it's actually pretty rare to have a year-long continuing resolution. We actually do usually get to appropriations bills. The appropriators take a lot of pride in the ability to do their job and get an appropriations bill done. It's a huge fight every year, but they usually get there. So I'm not saying that means we'll get one this year, because we've now already broken the seal on just doing a year-long CR, and we have a year-long CR, a year-long continuing resolution instead of appropriations bills in place now. So they could not do an appropriations bill. They could stick with a CR, but if they did that, sticking with a CR, that's now will be 2 years in place. You'd be going to FY24 funding. Over time, more and more things expire, more and more things become sort of out of date with inflation and other changes in the world. And so it becomes harder and harder to just survive on CR.
Yeah, and I think I want to just bring up a point Robin made about the voterama and about sort of the deep disagreement and kind of, I think, the feelings right now. This is a very human thing to say, but there are deep feelings on both sides of the aisle right now, and even within parties, you have folks who are engaged in very heated battles, both privately and publicly, and that type of kind of hurt feelings sometimes makes it really hard. I call it scorched earth, to turn a corner and then go back to potentially trying to work together and do so in a bipartisan way. So feelings matter, y'all. It's something to really consider. Okay, let's get to some specific questions about the budget in particular. So first of all, can Congress implement the president's proposed K-12 simplified funding block grant for education? So this is the proposal in the budget that consolidates a number of specific programs into one block grant that was then reduced through appropriations, or do they have to do anything else to make that happen? Can it simply be done through appropriations?
So the answer is technically it can simply be done through appropriations. Appropriations is a law. And so when you pass a law, you can write anything into it, just about. And so if you can write it, you can pass it. The reality is, though, that would be such a massive amount of changes in authorizing that there's almost no world in which the authorizers would allow the appropriators, would support the appropriators in rewriting their bill via the appropriations vehicle. And so while it's technically possible, it's incredibly unlikely. They would almost definitely have to go through some sort of an authorizing process to actually make that happen, particularly because it requires 60 votes. If this were a 50 vote undertaking, maybe you'd get all the Republicans to line up behind one another and get it done. But this is a 60 vote undertaking, and so that's unlikely.
Great. Couple questions I'm going to group together about forward funded grants. So since EIR grants are forward funded grants, are current EIR grantees safe from the FY26 budget request that zeroes out EIR? Very particular.
Yeah, I think, Erin, you sort of answered this one up front, right? As an EIR grantee, your current money is in place, and so you should have it for the year ahead. And if they do actually zero out EIR in the future, you may not get out year funds. And so it is not that your entire grant, so if you have like a 4-year EIR grant or a 3-year EIR grant, it's not that everything out into the out years would be safe, but at least the first year out is already forward funded and should be safe.
Yeah, and so that applies honestly not just to education grants, but other forward funded grants throughout the U.S. government. So whether it's NSF or NIH or DoD or so on and so forth, that's an answer that applies sort of universally across.
Although, as we've seen, just because they have the money and just because it's appropriated doesn't mean they won't cancel your grant or terminate your grant anyway. So nothing's really safe in this context.
Yeah. Can you talk just a second about impoundment? And the thing, frankly, that's come up, I think, this week in so many, I'm using moderator's privilege so folks can understand what you're meaning. What's really come up this week, I think, in many of the appropriations hearings with the agency leads and secretaries, is this question of, are you impounding the funds that we've already appropriated by just simply not doing the competitions or getting the money out the door? Can you talk a little bit about that very important, very present issue? Because I do think when we talk about hurt feelings, scorched earth, this is a real one.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I wish it was more real. I mean, here's what impoundment fundamentally means. We know that Congress is supposed to have the power of the purse. They are supposed to be able to say, this is what the money is, this is how much money you have, and this is how it will be spent. And then they send it over to the agencies and the administration disperses it. Now, what has happened is they have over the years sort of identified what happens if the administration decides not to disperse it. And there's this Impoundment Act, which says if the administration is not going to disperse it, there's a process they have to go through. The rescissions that we talked about in the beginning of this webinar are among the processes that can be used to say, we actually can't spend this money or don't want to spend this money that's been sent our way. But if you don't do a rescission, you are in violation of the Impoundment Act. You are basically saying, I know that Congress has the power of the purse. I know we're supposed to spend this, but we're just not going to. That is a violation of the Impoundment Act. And so it could be that people bring suit, and people are bringing suit. There are people currently in courts with suits against this administration saying you have violated the Impoundment Act by not spending money that has been given to you by Congress. Those suits are being litigated, and we don't know where they'll come out. There's this question of whether or not the administration has the right to say, yeah, we're going to spend this money eventually. We're just not spending it right now, or we're going to recompete all of these grants. And so we're going to get to that. And yet we don't have a recompetition in the pipeline. We don't have staff anymore who could do the recompetitions. This is why it has to be litigated. So a lot of this is going to have to be litigated to know at the end of the day whether or not they will be found in violation of the Impoundment Act. Meanwhile, Congress is getting mad. There are members of Congress who say, wait a minute, we funded these programs. We agreed to fund these programs. You need to spend these dollars. But I'll be honest, in the years and years, decades that I've been doing this work, there is often significant tension between Congress and the administration of the same party, because Congress jealously guards its prerogatives, its rights as a co-equal branch of government, and does not want the administration, even of their party, trampling on those rights. That is not showing up right now. We are actually seeing Congress let many of its prerogatives be trampled, and many members of Congress are sort of closing their eyes to things that in the past, no matter party, would have had them up in arms. We're hearing a lot of Democrats say impoundment. We're hearing a lot of Democrats say you have to spend these dollars. In the appropriations hearings that you're talking about, Erin, or in the budget hearings where we had administration officials up on the Hill, you did hear some whispers. There were some members on both sides of the aisle who said, wait a minute, shouldn't you be spending some of those funds?
Yeah,
but it was nothing like the full-throated condemnation that we would have heard in the past, which I think is just a signal about what to expect and not to expect Congress to stand up for right now.
Yeah, tone matters. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to let you
guys
guys go ahead. Yeah,
quick
Robin.
on impoundment. Impoundment was established in 1974 when we were doing the Congressional Budget Act. It was established as a response to the Nixon administration, partially because of the whole Watergate, they were impounding funds. So a little bit of a historical precedent there. And going forward, I think the Democratic staff of the Appropriations Committee want to write the bills very differently this year to the degree that they can. Again, they're not in power, but they want to be a little more prescriptive because of this impoundment issue.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Robin, I really appreciate that, right? So how it's going to influence not just this year, but likely that's a hard lesson learned. And so you'll see that really push through. Okay, Title II being cut. How is the administration expecting to fund Section 7 of the AIEO, enhancing training for educators on artificial intelligence?
Yeah, and I saw we had a similar question about literacy, and don't they want to fund literacy, and yet they're cutting Title II, where a lot of the literacy money lives. I'm going to tell you a very shocking secret. There's some hypocrisy going on. There are some people saying, we care a lot about this thing, and yet we're going to cut all of the funding for it. I think that there's zero concern about whether or not they'll be able to fund things that they've said they care about. I think there's far more interest in cutting funds and shrinking the footprint of the Department of Education and getting rid of the Department of Education. Those are far more important wins right now than sort of having what they consider marginal federal money to make headway on these big priorities. So I just don't think that I don't think that this is of concern to them at all. I don't think they're looking to say, oops, how are we going to be able to do these things we've said we want to do? They're going to cut where they can. And yes, Title II is definitely in that $4.65 billion cut that is being done through this big block grant proposal in the president's budget. Again, that has to go through regular order, will require 60 votes. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm saying this administration has no qualms about making it happen if they can.
Thoughts on federal work study in a minute. Can you talk a little bit about what that picture looks like? I'll also name there a little bit about TRIO, Gear Up, the sort of the set of things that's also related to work study or work study light programs. And obviously we just saw the Job Corps ceasing to operate on June 30, and that's in this current
what's happening
days.
now.
Yeah.
So, that Ed zeroed them out. I think it's unlikely to happen. Over on the House side, was a week ago, 2 weeks ago, you had Simpson talk about Gear Up trio. I had also heard that the administration knew that there was wide congressional support on those programs, and so they were strategic in what they zeroed out. But I think it's unlikely to happen.
Right. So what Robin's pointing out is they get to say, look how much we reduced the budget. Look at how much we're willing to cut. And then they know Congress is just going to put it back in. But I will say, if you don't take anything else away, take away the massive attack on higher education. Federal work study, huge decimating cut, 80% basically, gone from about 1.2 billion to about 200 million, and a requirement to increase the part that's paid by institutions of higher education, by the colleges and universities, and by employers, which basically means that you'll have a lot of lower income institutions of higher education that won't be able to offer work study anymore. So it's a massive work study cut. The trio in Europe zeroed out entirely. I mean, everything I said about what's in the reconciliation bill around student loans and Pell Grants, there is just a major, major attack on higher education going on across all of these processes, rescissions, budget, appropriations, they're using it all.
Bethany, I'm going to let you guys end with, like, if there's one thing people walk away with from this, what should they hear? I hear your attack on higher education. Is there one other that you wanted to say, or is that your final sort of like,
I guess I'll say one other thing.
TLDR, too long don't read, as my kids say.
Yeah, TLDR. And Robin may have one too. I think my big one is there are things that are going to happen that we're not going to be able to stop, and there are things that might happen depending on whether or not people get active. And so this is the time for democracy, that we are all playing a part because this belongs to all of us. So not all of this is inevitable. Just because they propose something doesn't mean Congress has to do it. And so I do think it's really important to be informed, to know where in the process you can have impact, and to know which are the things that are at risk. These risks are real. This is not playtime. Far, far more significant than anybody anticipated. And so if you think that something is at risk, you should get active about it.
I would also agree with democracy, yes. Calling up your locally elected officials, even your governors and your state legislature, even if this is, just you think this is a federal issue, it does impact. It's increasing costs to state, some of these proposed cuts. The other thing I will say is that there's a deadline to reconciliation, and that's the end of September. So anything we can do to slow it down, I think bodes well. Final thought, there's also talk of another reconciliation bill later this year. So buckle up.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. We're at our time. Honestly, I always learn something when I am in conversation with y'all. I hope everybody who is listening today learned something too. We got to all your questions, which was amazing. I just want to end the way I began, with just incredible gratitude. I think there are a lot of folks who are engaging for the first time in these issues, maybe because they've had their grant or contract canceled, because they're hearing about it in the news. They're worried about their student who might have disabilities having their Medicaid dollars cut. So I just really appreciate just the facts orientation we've taken, and really providing people with information. If you'd like this webinar and like to see us do it again or do something else, please pay attention to the Nightly Pulse and the Nightly Pulse poll, because that's how we figure out what programming the sector and the world needs. Again, thanks so much, Robin and Bethany. I'm always so grateful when people give their wisdom, their knowledge, and their time, and I'm certainly grateful to you today. Be well.